Right. So next we have the paper with probably the coolest title. Well, I don't know. The Elkins et al. Paper actually had a pretty good title. But Wanted Dead and Alive, Constitutionalism, Human Rights, and the Colonial Exception is the paper by Tayyab Mahmud. And our discussant is Karen Engle, and I want to highlight Karen Engle's contribution a little bit. She's my co-director at the Rapoport Center. Normally she would be doing all kinds of things. We've kind of displaced her from this conference. This would have been a much better conference if she had been running the whole thing. But she's the founding director of the Rapoport Center. She's deeply involved in everything we do, and now she's been gracious enough to join us as a discussant on Tayyab's paper. So thank you to both, and Tayyab, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I know that we are very pressed for time. I'll try to abide by the directives. This is a question that has troubled me and others, I'm sure, for a long time, namely when one talks about constitutionalisms and human rights, the question of universality always lurks in the background or the foreground. Also lurks in the foreground or the background is some implied or explicit notion of a linear progression of things, that one day it began, or in one place it began, and then it has been growing, and one day in the goodness of time we will all get there. Just hold on tight. For many of us, mine included, that always raises some issues about where the failures of universality happens, and in a particular way whether the usual way of framing that question is a inclusion-exclusion binary. Some people were excluded, but in goodness of time they are included, and the rest who are still excluded will get included, just wait up. And one wonders whether there may not be some other ways of looking at that issue, and here I take from work particularly of Peter Fitzpatrick about the law itself, work of Denise De Silva, particularly around the question of race, a bit of work of Tony Engle around work on international law. So anyway, where I'm try to at least encapsulate the issue is that perhaps it may be a better way of thinking of, instead of ditching the exclusion-inclusion binary and thinking of this question of the universality in others as always included in subordination thesis, as I'm tentatively calling it, that the other is always in. The other is always engulfed, but then there is an exception invoked which facilitates a subordination. So in order to sort of explore this proposition, I'm going to look at, in fact, the initial draft of this, the last part of the paper was written as the bomb started falling on Iraq back in 2003. And particularly a place came in view then also, which is the largest U.S. military, overseas military base from where B-52s have flown rather regularly to bring rule of law and democracy to distant lands. And as it turned out, there is an interesting story behind it, and then there's a string of cases that relate to it, but I've been picking on one which I still see as a foundational case there, and this is in some ways a close reading of that case to unpack again this universality, inclusion, exclusion question. There's a long history to it, but again, in the interest of time, very quickly, a Portuguese colony, and then a French colony, and then a British colony, and then in the waning days of the Vietnam War, the Americans looking for better real estate to dispense their global responsibilities, and the location is fantastic. It's in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and so that's where they were going to build a base. There were two problems. One was the eye of the world, namely United Nations, pesky things like Congress and Parliament, citizens and media. And then there were people lived there for a few hundred years. And so, and this all was done under secret agreements hidden from the eye of everybody. And the decision was that we have an awkward problem, that these islands need to be cleared out. First they were thinking of a different island, but then it turned out that there were giant turtles there, and that you can't mess with. So then, messing with people is always a better proposition. And so, again, and all the inhabitants were kicked out, put on boats, and it was still then, by the way, a colony as a part of Mauritius. But as Mauritius was a decolonization time, so first move was to sever it from Mauritius, create it as a separate colony, British Indian Ocean Territory, sweep it clean, lease it to the Americans, base is built, and it says now, Dio Garcia, the footprint of freedom. The people that got kicked out, they knocked at the doors of the courts, both the American courts and the British courts. The American way is always easier, political question doctrine. This involves stuff that where courts don't dare, and that was the end of that. The British phenomena, however, has percolated for many years. Finally, the House of Lords spoke in 2008, and then the matter went up even to the European Court of Justice, which spoke in 2012. But I am dealing with a foundational case here which got decided in 2001 at the King's Bench. Again, the issue being, have these folks been removed legally? And my reading of the case shows that it precisely does that three-step tango of engulfment, invocation of exception, and then subordination. The engulfment comes with the jurisdiction question. A lot of the government of the courts don't have jurisdiction because it's a colony, but this should go through the other parallel system, ending up with the Privy Council. There'll be a danger of conflicting opinions, or maybe perhaps the crown here is separate than the crown there, etc., etc. Again, in the interest of time, the court simply said no. We have jurisdiction. They don't have any court system, much less a parallel court system. When again invoking old dictums going back to Mansfield and others, basically, no, we will hear the case. They are in. They are kind of part of the game. They are not outside of it. Quickly then, of course, then the question of, so what is the standard of review over this action which has been taken? So that's where the exception sets in. And interestingly enough, the judge who wrote the opinion, his name itself is Laws. So Justice Laws. And Justice Laws himself had enunciated the since then standard of judicial review of executive and legislative actions, which as it shows known as the Witham principle, that a fundamental constitutional right cannot be abridged by the executive only, or can be only where it is specifically authorized by express words of an enabling act of the Parliament. However, the government pleaded for, and the court agreed, that no, in this case, the Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865 applies, because this, at the end of the day, is a colony, and in the colonial standard of review is a different one, namely that no colonial law shall be deemed to be void or inoperable on grounds of repugnancy to the law of England, unless it is repugnant to some act of Parliament made applicable to such colony by express words, etc., etc. Anyway, in a longish discussion there. So first you bring them in. We have jurisdiction, but now there is an exception by way of a differential positioning because of their status being a colony rather than regular folk, which then directly, and again, a lot of discussion that is in the paper that you can see, the draft, I should say, that I don't have the time to get into. But even the language is rather interesting, but in the interest of time, moving right along, then what kinds of somersaults, almost rhetorical and legal, get played to kind of maintain this this distinction, even though the decisions are being made, the decisions about being executed and all of that, right sitting there in London, which was the excuse being made why one has jurisdiction. But now suddenly the colonial proposition subordinates all of that, and the distinction as to how much quote-unquote belongers there can benefit from the rule of law and the belongers here can, and this distinction sets in. And then comes the subordination, as it were, where the big part of the discussion was, and it was interesting, we were talking about Magna Carta earlier, one of the primary, though not the only, argument made by the petitioners was that this is a violation of the Magna Carta, particularly Chapter 29, which I was interesting that nobody really talked about that involves exile and all that. So the question was whether the Magna Carta overcomes the Colonial Laws Validity Act, which is giving cover to this exile. And now the court pulls out a Calvin case from 1608 and Campbell case from 1774 to make the argument that no, as opposed to what, for example, Canadian Supreme Court has said that the Magna Carta goes with the flag. They said no, Magna Carta goes with the white if it is in the white settler's hands. So this is my executive translation, because there's a distinction between where is the flag going. If it's a settler colony, then the laws of England and the protections of Magna Carta go. But if it's a ceded colony, a conquered space or ceded space, then all bets are off. And because this was a Portuguese colony and then given in dowry to somebody to France and then given over in Treaty of Paris to England, so no deal. So that this entrenched distinction between even types of colonies started in early 17th century holds, and again this background I have given you why Supreme Court of Canada has spoken otherwise, and Lord Denning had spoken otherwise, but it was interesting and that here this distinction was resurrected. And then it said that even if Magna Carta had applied, so what? All Magna Carta says is that that cannot be exiled, but by the law of the land. And again, a narrower reading of what rule of law means. So they said, well, we're not going into no rule of law area, but a thinner, and that was a remarkable language, there would be a thinner rule of law there. And the commissioner of this territory, after all, can make laws for peace, order, and good governance. And so there is no limit to his or her discretion and all, save that you need somebody to govern. So these people, even with the thinner rule of land, you can't exile them. Then you can govern them however you want to govern them, without protections of any rights or laws of England or Magna Carta or whatever, but you can't not have anybody, because how are you going to have good governance without a live body? So that's where my adage of wanted dead and alive comes in, that you can't exile, but then you can do with them, short of exile, whatever the heck you want to do. So that's, since then the court case went up, and at the end of the day the House of Lords also rejected the petitioners, in fact reversed even this case, and upheld the exile in light of a new ordinance passed in 2004. And finally, the European Court has also said that they can go to hell because they actually got some compensation. By the way, there's a very interesting case on that, as to, and anthropologists would have a field day as to how that compensations happened and how many were illiterate. By the way, this was a matriarchal society. So all through these opinions and all through these correspondences of the Foreign Office, you have these overt and not so overt digs about, that, and the act is just women, so, no really big deal. So perhaps another exception is in play. Anyway, I know that my time is gone. So again, all one is suggesting is that perhaps the euphoria or chronic euphoria about this linear development from some center to all across the globe about human rights and constitutionalism may need a little bit of a pause to think about how the continuation of subordination happens, and not as an outside and inside, but always as an inside, but an exception having been invoked, which opens the door for subordination. So the colony is alive and well, the B-52s are alive and well, and rule of law is just about to be established in Afghanistan and Iraq. Thank you.
Thanks, Mom. Karen.
Thanks, Tayyab, for this paper. And you can tell it's very rich. There's an awful lot in it. But I think it offers a great read of this decision, Bangkok versus Secretary of State. And in particular, to demonstrate the way I read it, the dark side, not just the limits of both liberal internationalism, which he wasn't able to get into as much here, and liberal democracy. And the case is also used to reject the claim that the U.S.-British compact that expelled the Chagos Islanders from Diego Garcia was aberrational, or even a clear wrong that could be attended to by the correct constitutional or human rights interpretation. So the paper has many points, and it even has a lot of beautiful asides in brackets. So I say that as an aside, because there's a lot in those. And a great deal of analysis about the relationship of modern law to colonial violence and the ways in which they're deeply intertwined and mutually productive that I can't possibly do justice to. But at the same time, as Tayyab was just telling you a little bit more of the story, the decision he talks about is really only a slice of litigation spanning over a decade, not just against the UK, and not only against the UK in the Queen's Bench and the House of Lords, but also in the European Court of Human Rights. But also there was litigation against the United States, since, after all, it was the United States that displaced that it was for the U.S. base that the islanders were displaced. And so I thought that, not knowing Tayyab was going to tell you as much as he did, but that's okay, I thought that I would actually first talk about Tayyab's interpretation of the case, and then tell a bit about what I know has happened in the last decade with regard to the Chagos Island litigation, and much of which I admit I learned yesterday, and think some about what Tayyab's analysis might actually have to say to some of those newer developments, because I think there are some distinctions going on there that would be worth pulling out. I also want to say, ironically, the opinion that he spends so much time on is the only one in which the islanders prevail. So even if in a very limited way and for a short time, they did win the case. And that is kind of crucial, I guess, to my slightly different interpretation. So it's not until the very end of Tayyab's description of the case in the paper, but also I think in the oral presentation, or maybe ever, actually, that we learned that they won, which I feel like, because I think, Tayyab, I assume you don't want to exactly say they won. They didn't win, but they won the particular elements of this case, even if they did so because the British were seen as having exceeded even this very thin rule of law that applied to the islanders. And I was surprised to read, actually, that they'd won, because I have known a bit about the case, and you always hear that they've lost, and I'd forgotten that it was after several appeals. And also, as I said, because I think much of the way that he tells the story, and this is actually important to the reading of the case, makes you think that they are going to lose, and the court's doing all kinds of surprising things. So dissonance is a word that comes up throughout the paper to talk about the judicial opinion given that end. And so it has this dramatic effect when you're reading it But it did make me then have to go back and rethink my initial understanding of what the opinion was doing, and it made some things less surprising and some more surprising. So with that, I'll offer this slightly different interpretation, and this is really based only on Tayyab's reading of the case. I haven't read the decision. And then suggest a way I think that he can maybe make more out of the fact that they won by comparing the judicial reasoning, the techniques of judicial reasoning in this case to other techniques used by other courts as they've adjudicated it. And that might suggest, Tayyab, that you loosen the rigid structuralism of the piece a bit, so that engulfment, invocation of exception, and subordination, I think, does aptly describe this opinion. I have a few minor differences with it, but I think I'll just leave that for now. But I don't think it aptly describes maybe all of the opinions that are confronted with the racialized and colonized other, as it's suggested at the beginning of the piece, sort of there's a constant production of this technology. So since you all got I'm not going to try to summarize the engulfment, exception, subordination, because that was a good rendition of it. But I will just say that it does end very much with subordination and governance. And I think that it is really important, obviously, that they end up, that the court finds that the islanders can't be expelled, and it's also incredibly important, as the paper so richly shows, how they do that, so that they reject the fundamental rights, they use the, maybe the Magna Carta applies, but it only applies in the reading of the colonial law, and seeing the court in 2002 interpret the 1850 law. I mean, it's incredible. I think that the decision is an incredible read, it sounds like, and certainly Tayyab's rendition of it is. But still, it seems important that they find limits placed on the governance. And I guess just based on your reading in the paper, I didn't agree with the end point, maybe, when you said they can do anything they want in terms of governance, because it still seemed that the peace, order, and good governance had some restrictions, if very few. But I wonder how maybe else we might characterize the limitations that the court placed on that governance, other than simply calling it subordination. Because I think you're absolutely right, it's subordination, but it's a particular form of it that seems different from other forms. So I guess the suggestion would be to say, what if we started the paper with the court's conclusion that the islanders couldn't be expelled, but then show how the court felt the need to reach that decision through colonial rather than colonial law rather than fundamental rights. And it seems that's really important because they end up redeeming colonial law, actually, even more strongly than Tayyab's initial analysis suggests. Because they're saying it's still applicable, it's actually still a part of modern law, and we can interpret it and need to interpret it. And yet, they redeem it by saying it can be interpreted in ways that prohibit the expulsion. And a lot of people, as I understand, were very upset with the use of colonial law, right? I mean, it would have been much easier, and I think that was a lot of the point of the paper, to say there were other means available that would have been more comfortable, and yet the court didn't go down that route, even if it did want to rule for them at some level. And I think that might be for a second reason that I kind of want to throw out there, which it seems to me that the decision also restrains the extraterritorial reach of the Constitution, which seems to be important not just because of the ongoing, blips of colonialism, you might say, but also because it seemed to me the decision actually came down in March 2002, when I looked back into it. So I didn't do all the work, but it seemed to me that there could be something there about the challenges to the United States and the UK in the post 9/11 extraterritorial, right? So there were many challenges to the reach, or suggestions, certainly, the attention, let me try this again. So by then, there were already challenges to U.S. and UK actions under the constitutions and fundamental rights that were being challenged by the countries as extraterritorial, so our laws don't apply outside the territory. And it seems to me that that's important to the rest of the tale, maybe. And it seemed like the little bit I know about the European Court of Human Rights case, this was also important. So they were looking at it very much in the extraterritorial mode. Then I'll just say a little bit more than about what I know about those decisions. So after this decision, it actually did have immediate effect, in principle, for the islanders. So there was an order. They were allowed to move back onto the island. They didn't want to move back at that point, and that raises a whole bunch of other issues. Many of them sought compensation. They would not exchange compensation for giving up the right to return, so they wanted to make it very clear that even if they weren't returning, they still had that right. In 2004, a new order then prohibited their return, and that was the challenge to that order that was initially successful and then was reversed by the House of Lords. So the Chagos Islanders did eventually take that case to the European Court of Human Rights, and it was rendered inadmissible, and I thought in large part because of the lack of jurisdiction over overseas territories. So a lot of it had to do with when the UK had signed on to individual petitions and whether they had actually said that it would apply to their territories. It applied to Mauritius, but they made a technical argument that they succeeded on. So the court never heard it, lack of jurisdiction, and actually just notably the court had refused to follow that with regard to UK actions in Basra, where they had said that the jurisdiction applied. Okay, so no jurisdiction. That seems different to me from the technique used in the earlier case. The Chagosians also brought an alien tort claim against the United States. It was dismissed and upheld. The dismissal was upheld because of political question doctrine. So that's just to say, and I'll end here, that both of those decisions, it seems to me, don't fit in some ways the way the exclusion engulfment models describe their more exclusion, although I agree at a theoretical level, engulfment, that those do sound more exclusion. They just don't want to deal with it. They don't take jurisdiction in the way that the earlier court does. And it seems to me then that it means we have at least three models of judicial action, all permitting UK governance, including through actions with the United States of the Chagos Islands. The UK and European court decisions have led to calls for modern law, so a lot of people say, how can human rights mean this? By which they have in mind some idea of law untainted by colonialism. So it's a bad decision because you see colonialism. And I think Tayyab has a lot to say about that. And that widening the frame might allow him to say a little bit much more about the multiple and sometimes unexpected ways in which colonial governance continues to imbue modern law, even human rights and constitutional law.
Thank you, Karen. So what does the Greek chorus have to say about this paper?
So I think the paper is really interesting in the sense that it makes us question how universal this kind of era of universal human rights really is, right? And what it gets me thinking about is you've identified a set of groups, probably in the scheme of things a fairly small set of actors that aren't protected by these rights. But what it makes me think about is there a larger set of actors somewhere that also lacks that protection, either because they don't have the same culture to enjoy those rights, or they're somehow disenfranchised, they can't bring cases before the courts. So there's a whole set of actors that kind of fall under this kind of classification and thinking in somewhat broader terms about what that group is. And then, just as a point of clarification on Magna Carta, so not to clarify you, but for everybody else. So the Article 29 that was referred to in the presentation, Magna Carta was reissued 3 times. So the 1215 version, all the legal process rights are in Articles 38, 39, and 40. When they reissued it in 1217, Articles 39 and 40 were combined into an Article 29. That was again reissued in 1297, and that's the Article 29 that's still in force today that you were referencing in your talk. So just to be clear.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm very interested. I found the story, the narrative, very interesting, but it brought me a puzzle that I always have about these trials, which is why would people bring these trials to the courts? It's just economic of the U.S. or the U.K. It's just economic incentives. Do you know the people behind the actual litigants, or is it that they have an underlying belief that they may actually win, and it's worth going through the natural re-edition of the subordination that it implies to go to the courts of your, I don't know, I don't know. So this was one of the parts, and it reminded me of Julieta's presentation today, where there is something emotional behind the idea of going through this suffering and maybe getting the money or maybe getting a success. And what do you think about it? It's of course not the subject of your paper, but I wonder whether you know the story behind the litigants.
Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on Karen's last point about thinking about these strategies of neocolonialism. So you identify this as you do in the beginning of the paper, as sort of a strategy that is used over and over again. But I agree with Karen that there are different strategies that get used, and it might, and that would be really interesting in the sense that then this particular set of strategies wouldn't constrain the way you're thinking about. You could expand your horizons, but also point out that they aren't actually always the same moves that get made. And if they were the same moves that got made, then it might be easier to deal with. And instead, the moves are sort of complex and constantly in flux, and in fact contradictory. So I, for example, have written about this almost in a very similar way, thinking of these strategies of thinking of sort of a series of moves that gets made, but the way that I thought about it was that it was simultaneous assimilation and exclusion in the service of subordination. And that was a strategy of colonial and neocolonial dispossession. But it's just another one. I think that one that I had thought of, that's not enough. This one also, it puts you in a straitjacket, which fails to appreciate the inventiveness of the strategies that are available.
So I found that was just fantastic, and I finally have something to say. So I think that you identified the structure of colonial rule, and I can certainly give you a lot of examples of Spanish colonial rule and how that's exactly the way the argument is built. And it really makes sense if you place rule of law as an Enlightenment project, because if you go back to Locke or Rousseau, every time that they mention America, it's a justification. The rule of law justifies colonization. It's a state of nature. So it's already built in the definition itself of the rule of law. It's premised on the existence of America and of the existence of the state of nature. And in a sense, it's the colonial encounter that spurns this flurry of thinking about the new form of the state that will allow colonization, in a sense, or that will do it successfully. So I do think that that's already in there, in the idea of the rule of law. But so I was going to push you somewhere else, which is the incredible success of European expansion, cultural, military, economic, I think it's built not so much on the structure, but on what we are staging here. So it's always horrified at what it's doing. Since the colonial encounter, the feeling of there's a performance of shame that's just part of the same act. So it's like an actor that's doing all the parts in the play, just changing his costume. It's an incredibly solipsistic project of doing these terrible things and then just being horrified at the dark side of them, just looking at the mirror all the time. So I was wondering if you think that there's an outside to this. If it's possible to talk about colonialism without performing the shame that's part of the project, that's always been there from its inception. And there's one person in the Enlightenment philosophers that I think was into something, which is Diderot, who was the one Enlightenment philosopher who hated European expansion. And his argument, he thought it was a very bad idea to have colonies. And he said, if you take Europeans out of Europe, they turn into savages. You cannot take the white man out of Europe, because then it doesn't work. So.
Great. Discussant comments were very, very helpful in contextualizing the case and also in helping me regain faith in rule of law. And this paper is a very depressing paper. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, rule of law is such a sham. We should abandon it, or at least, make a radical modification to it. But listening to what the discussant was saying, and I tend to think that, as problematic as rule of law might be, it's better than alternatives. So should we still believe in rule of law, or do you propose to do something else? That's kind of broad question, but I wonder how you comment.
Could I just 5 seconds
Sure.
to say that wasn't my intent to give you faith in the rule of law.
We now, all of us believe in human rights and constitutionalism. Now, Karen, thank you.
The rule of law.
All right, yes, to the audience.
I have trouble putting this within the context of universal human rights because there is no plausible right not to be displaced from one's home. This is simply eminent domain. And eminent domain occurs all the time. There are, across the world, dam cases where people are displaced in order to build dams. And one can like some of these on political grounds or be appalled by some of them on political grounds. But it seems to me that the crux of the matter in terms of rule of law is compensation. I mean, within American law, there's also, we could argue about public purpose, that property can't be taken except for public purpose. But for better and very much for worse, this meets a public purpose, national defense. So I'd like actually to pick up on your side comment about turtles, that one difference between turtles and human beings is that actually we expect human beings to accept a certain amount of displacement in return for compensation. And that's what the rule of law means. Whereas with turtles, we assume that they're endangered, they can't be moved without extinction. And so we end up, paradoxically or not, having more sympathy for the turtles, more legal sympathy for the turtles than for the human beings because, the story of humanity from the very beginning is movement and people being displaced and learning to live with it. And what the rule of law does is to try to minimize the disruptions if possible and compensate, rightly or wrongly, compensation is thought to do that rather than an injunctive right to stay in the old family farm regardless of what use could be made of the farm by the state, whether it's a colonial state or the most enlightened state that one can imagine. They're still going to build dams and still going to displace people from the family farm.
So I want to pick up on Sandy's comment because it actually follows on some of the things I was thinking. When I was listening to your paper, it's fascinating, and in reading it, it really is just a fascinating story, especially the way you presented it today. And I kept on thinking, okay, what is Diego Garcia in itself is a fascinating story, but what is it a case of? If you listen to that, you think, okay, how should this have been? How should this have proceeded differently? And also, how have other cases proceeded? So obviously the footprint of the United States military is massive at this point, and now they've been building bases all over the world and operating cases of or exercising the right to eminent domain all over the world, often in territories. In fact, I can't think of a U.S. territory that doesn't have a major base, and so I'm guessing that this happens all the time, and probably infringing upon territories of the UK in the same way and doing this all the time. So it makes me wonder about that. And it seems like if you think about all those cases, you could leverage in an analytic way differences among those cases to see if, because this is an ethnic population that's particularly vulnerable because they don't have any sovereignty and are, really a neo-colony, in this case of the UK, but you can think of the U.S. neo-colonies as well. Are they treated any differently from one in which, say, there is a U.S. base in Japan or Spain, in the case of NATO, or the status of forces agreements in many other countries where we move in and operate in a way, in some ways, that might actually be more of an infringement upon human rights. If you think about the status of force agreements, when we operate there, our forces often commit these atrocities against locals, and the U.S. forces are often not prosecuted for them. And to me, those seem like, to some degree, grosser violations of human rights than sort of a methodical movement of people back to Mauritius or wherever they're moved. And so I guess in some ways the comment is, okay, to think more broadly outside of Diego Garcia and think if there are any aspects of this case which, kind of are particularly interesting in the broader perspective.
Right. Tayyab?
Yes. Okay. Well, the last two, by my lights, are the easy ones, so I can deal with that. Sandy's, eminent domain over land that belongs to you, to the sovereign. But one of the main problems here was that being a non-self-governing territory, the polite name for a colony under the UN arrangements, Britain was supposed to keep them informed, quote unquote, about any changes, about anything. And so part of the whole charade is to keep it from anybody knowing that this is going on. So I would suggest that, of course, eminent domain is there, but then eminent domain is within your domain, not in somebody's domain. It is not a Okinawa case either, because Okinawa-like case that Okinawa, at least as you yourself suggested, these situations go under an agreement for the blah, 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 and then somebody rapes or kills. But still underlying there is a sovereign agreement between Japan and whoever, or Pakistan and whoever, that you can have a base there. Not here. This is you just doing on your own free will, as it were. So in that sense, it is a sui generis, which doesn't fit the other cases. Anyway, I don't know in what order one should go. I think the Greek jury then next, perhaps, maybe the issue of like how many came up, how large, so how many are sufficient, like how many need to die or how many need to be exterminated for the point to be made. So I wasn't sure that it is a quantitative question to hang one's hat on that. One on the thing about varieties and of colonial strategies and all, I couldn't agree more. One and I'll come back to that issue that this intervention anyway is not about that as to what all shapes and forms and things colonial rule can take. Now it's, almost everybody knows that. It would be stupid to claim that this is how colonialism works. It's a little also complete agreement there. The more on the last one, if not rule of law, then where, in one way it reminds me again of the canonical almost after the death of God and all that, the sort of justification of modern law. Well, at the end of the day, the justification is that we don't do it not how the savages do it, whether it's a law for anybody else. But the thing about just this, how foundational this question is to modern law, that is being certainly underscored, and that point was made, and I'm completely aligned with that, and trying to understand more as to, to how deep does it go? And back to, then do you reach the rule of law? No, nobody's suggesting that, but to understand modern law itself. And I'm very sympathetic here to particularly the way Peter Fitzpatrick has been trying over the last few decades to think of modern law as sort of, again, in some ways a Janus-faced, you might say, or sort of two tendencies, you might say, more sort of order and responsiveness to change. So that there is that possibility in the law's point of, and that to some extent answers the Columbia question or today's question, why people still go to it, because it also contains within itself the seed of responsiveness, even though on the other end tied to a very, very violent, never quite gotten over the nightmare of that violent dream. So yeah, there is, so in that sense, yes, we do need perhaps just like colonialism of the law itself, that it's a more malleable and a amorphous and an interesting thing than, good, no bad kind of a thing, and it's okay to recognize its vulnerabilities. This doesn't mean that you're going to be sent to some black hole, and that I want to come to the black hole, because a lot of conversation has happened around Guantanamo and stuff. Oh, that's not a black hole. Black hole implies that there's nothing going on there. Well, there's a lot going on here, a lot of legal argumentation and stuff. In the interest of time, I'm about to come back to, thanks so much, and again, as I said, this has been going on in my head for the long time, but I do want to underscore, and this is not to run away from the argument, because those are issues that I am engaged with otherwise. But here I'm not, the project is not colonialism. The project is not Diego Garcia. The project is, again, the grammar of relationship between the promise and claim of universality and the persistent failure of it. And how do we conceptualize it? How do we then translate it? And how do we get some kind of grip on it to make sense of wherever that percolates? And it doesn't just percolate in the colonial question. It doesn't just percolate in Diego Garcia. It percolates every time gender or race or sexuality, or like we can, do the whole checklist here. So all at one is suggest. So that's what interests me. That if you, and not to say, oh, this is it, and I found it. But all I'm suggesting here is that this is, at a minimum, more productive than the exclusion-inclusion binary which overwhelms these conversations. So I want to make that very clear, that yes, there's a lot of talk about colonialism here, and this case is being used, but that's not the project. That's not what is keeping me awake at night. But now, coming back to the extent that it is and stuff, I was reminded, as you were also talking of some other parallels, as it were. But let me. So I'll be thinking a lot more in light of what you have said, to the extent that that becomes a project. Again, to say that this opinion follows this grammar is not to claim that every case about this issue or every other issue follows this grammar. It may be that we are also talking about maybe and I need to do more thinking about it, because it lends itself to a slipperiness of scale, perhaps. that when one is talking about the dissonance between promise and actuality of universality, that again, then grammar operates at many levels, epistemological levels, writing of opinion levels, and it just like then, as one said, the technologies of colonialism are different, so are discourse. Not every case follows the same pattern and what have you. And by the way, this notion of that they won what? Won what? They are saying that, yeah, you can come. By the way, they never went back to, they were never allowed to go back to Diego Garcia. U.S. Pentagon made sure of that. The day the judgment was passed, the day another, yet again, now not any more secret agreements were reached. But so one what? They are saying, yeah, we can't exile you. But and yes, there is a limit, border to the tapestry of good governance and stuff. But what is that border? They can't go there in terms of it. It keeps coming back to that you can pretty much do whatever, but you need a live body to do something with. You can't govern a dead body, even though I think perhaps they need to think enough. Perhaps dead bodies can be ruled over. So but I'll be thinking more of it, so I appreciate that a lot. The parallels a little bit which may be helpful in this narrow context, not on the universality question at large, and as I'm suggesting, maybe there it slips, and that's my fault, the way it gets presented, that a scale confusion happens, that as if one is giving a structure of how every case gets decided. I frankly am, as you probably know, never interested in cases or how cases get decided. I have other maybe more ridiculous problems that haunt me. But in the American case, for example, generally I think Okinawa is not an interesting example. Interesting example would be insular cases, for example, which are still good law. Curtis Wright, for example, which claims and says clearly that the notion that the government under the written constitution is a government of limited, delegated, and blah blah powers is just part of the story. As far as this, it's foreign affairs and all that, war powers are concerned. It's a different lineage. It's a successor to the crown. So, and it's a very interesting. I'm always fascinated when one reads that opinion. And again, good law. Which dovetails then back to, on these later cases, the notion of prerogative, that again almost the limit of the constitutional arrangement, the limits of the law, that whether from a law to this case, they keep running into that, and you can't just wish it away. One wishes that one could wish it away, but you can't wish it away, that there are these sort of foundational limits in the brew. Though still one looks for those responsive openings in the law to do whether Chagos or, by the way, there is a lot written. In fact, one court very cynically wrote about like who brings these cases, were these really the people affected or those who want to get some mileage out of it. I personally don't feel that there is anything wrong with that either. Public interest litigation goes on all the time. I think I've taken more time than, but this has been very rich. I'll be talking to you more because this gives me an opening to think more, and please tell me more so I can get more done. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. So on this rather gloomy assessment of the possibilities, we're going to take no more than 10-minute coffee break, much delayed and now abbreviated coffee break. And we'll come back, and then we'll be roughly 35 minutes behind, which is not so bad. And then we'll turn to a much more hopeful version of what rights can do. Rights make might next.